Tyrese Haliburton has made the most of his playoff opportunity, hitting dagger after dagger and shutting down the sentiment of him being the most overrated player. But when speaking about the particular topic, he had some high praise for our very own Joel Embiid on how to get through this turbulent time in his career. I do want to reflect on exactly what this means for both Haliburton and Embiid, and why Joel may be turning the exact page that we need him to in his story from an overall personality perspective. I do want to talk about each of these things here, and of course reflect a little bit on what could have been with Tyrese Haliburton, who we all remember so vividly were involved in those Ben Simmons trade rumors back when this train first started to get out of the tracks in Philadelphia here. Now, to dive into exactly what Haliburton said, I do just want to start with the outright quote here, and shout out to Sixers Wire here. I believe this was Kai Carlin who initially transcribed this. The article writes, Haliburton credits Embiid and Tatum for, quote, keeping it 100 conversations that helped him build an immunity to rejection. Embiid, who has been subject to ridicule as he fails to stay healthy, has been texting with Haliburton throughout the postseason, imploring him to shoot the ball more. At some point, worrying about what my peers think only holds so much weight. I think my peers, whom I really respect, that changes things, Haliburton said. For that poll, there's no names to faces. It's all anonymous. Having relationships with guys like Jason and Joel, who are guys that I know at the top of the game, them being honest with me, that's important. I respect their opinions more than anybody. And I do think this is very cool for Haliburton to kind of break this down. He is, of course, a pure sweat guy working with Drew Hanlon, who I'm a huge fan of as well. Had a chance to meet him a couple months ago, and awesome dude. A guy who speaks incredibly highly of all of his athletes in a way that I think is kind of cool to see the way they train and ride for him. And we're seeing the effects of the work that they do put in. It is not coincidental that the players that he works with, like Tyrese Haliburton here, are taking their games to new heights. It is indisputable the growth that we've seen from guys like Joel Embiid throughout their tenure here, and kind of cool that there is this like community that has been built among them. But of course, the poll that is being referred to is this most overrated poll here. We see it run year in and year out from The Athletic here. I do think it's a bit corny that these guys don't get to put their name on it. And with Tyrese Haliburton specifically, I don't think guys take this as who is the most overrated. I think they kind of think this is who's the guy that we don't really like that much, and that is Tyrese Haliburton in this case. Now, with all this being said, as you can see Haliburton at the top of the list, and our very own Joel Embiid on this list as well. You can see him pulling in 3.3% of the votes there. Paul George right below him as well, also making his presence felt here. None of these guys, to be perfectly honest with you, would be what I view as most overrated. Like, again, I think the conversation gets a little bit distorted into players making it who they want it to be about in regard of, who to come down on here, and Haliburton ultimately falling on the sword. But what I think is so cool about it is the way that Haliburton is making the most of his moment and changing the narrative firsthand. We are seeing it on full force, him doing the big balls dance, him putting everything on the table for who he is as a basketball player in a way that I think is very cool. Now, to reflect on the Haliburton to the Philadelphia era, I do think the sentiment gets a bit larger than it concerns. And there is good reason for that. Like, Haliburton himself thought he was coming to Philadelphia and has been open up on saying as such. We did get a trade report like this saying that the 76ers have asked the Kings for Tyrese Haliburton and multiple first-round picks and a trade package for Ben Simmons. This coming from The Athletic here. Now, my pushback to this is you can ask for whatever you want. That does not mean an organization is going to say yes. And while I understand some of the louder voices in Philly media have very much pushed the narrative that the Sixers had on an offer on the table in a Ben Simmons / Tyrese Haliburton sort of conversation, we've also seen the exact opposite reported. And to kind of reference that, I do want to pull this up from Mark Stein, who I do believe is very plugged in and one of the guys that I can kind of trust with this stuff. And he wrote, quote, sources briefed on those trade talks insisted to the Stein line last week that contrary to the persistent speculation about Sacramento's reported interest in Ben Simmons back then, Philadelphia was not offered a Tyrese Haliburton-centric package for Simmons, Stein wrote on his Substack. I'm sure that there were conversations, as are expected to be the case, of would you do this, would you do that? I do find it unlikely that there was a directly, here's Tyrese Haliburton and stuff for Ben Simmons, and let's make a deal happen. And to put us in these shoes, I know hindsight is 20/20, but I do think Daryl Morey very much looked at this as this was the full emergence, this timeline when Ben was fully, coming off the rails here, that this was the full emergence of Joel legitimately being an MVP candidate, of him being one of the clear-cut top 3 best players in the league. And at that time, with Tyrese Haliburton, him now just being 25, this being 3 years ago when he was 22, that I think Morey did look at it as this has to be the all-in win-now approach. And say what you want about James Harden, but I do think in Morey's head, that is how he looked at this conversation. Now, again, it is hindsight 20/20, and obviously looking back, if we could have made a different decision and are talking about a backcourt of Tyrese Haliburton and Tyrese Maxey, we'd be living pretty good here in Philadelphia and probably are not counting down the days till the draft lottery, which we are less than a week toward at this point. But nonetheless, the bottom line is we got to operate moving forward. Now, there is a larger point that I did want to hit on here with Joel Embiid specifically. It does feel like for years we have begged and pleaded for this guy to grow up a little bit, to be a bit more mature, to take on a leadership standpoint. I understand that Tyrese Haliburton is not his teammate per se, but I think this shows a little bit about Joel. And I think with Joel specifically, he's been a dude who the guys that he cares about, he expresses quite clearly. And now we've seen plenty of guys who have not fit that criteria and do not get the same treatment from Joel Embiid here, and that is a problem as well. But I think Haliburton's a guy who falls under that kind of umbrella, and we're seeing Embiid lead through. We have a couple other quotes that I did want to pull up from that particular article here, such as chats with the Philadelphia 76ers Joel Embiid and Boston Celtics Jason Tatum helped Indiana Pacers star Tyrese forge and, quote, immunity to rejection after he was voted the NBA's most overrated player by his fellow players. Quote, at some point, worrying about what my peers think only holds so much weight, Haliburton said to the Athletics' Jared Weiss. I think my peers, whom I really expect, that changes things. For that poll, there's no names to faces. It's all anonymous. Having a relationship with guys like Jason and Joel, who are guys that I know at the top of the game, them being honest with me, that's important. I respect their opinions more than anybody, and I also think there's something a bit true to when we talk about Joel Embiid. When you listen to how players talk about Joel Embiid versus how media talks about Joel Embiid, there's a pretty significant gap here. And I get we're not going to be able to duck or change the conversations about availability and injury status and all these type of things here. But the bottom line is I think it should be telling to us that there's a lot more respect in how Joel Embiid is spoken about from the player perspective than a lot of the talking heads on ESPN, from the Kendrick Perkins of the world to the guys throwing things against the wall and hoping it sticks, to the guys who know ball, learn ball, play ball, respect Joel Embiid a whole lot more about that. And Tyrese Haliburton certainly at the forefront of that movement there. So all around, I do think this is a great storyline here. Again, this should be a bit of a humbling experience for Joel Embiid. The fact that he's having to sit on the couch and watch these NBA games in the same way you and I are should be a feeling of, I never want to do this again. And in fairness to Joel, that has been true to this point. That when Joel Embiid is on the floor, that is a good basketball team. That has been true throughout the duration of his career. Is not the case this season, and they do have to adjust accordingly to this point. So this should be the low point for Joel Embiid, that we can launch off the NBA draft lottery, changing the outlook, the perception of this franchise moving forward, but it's going to take a bought-in version of Joel Embiid, carrying himself in the 100 proper way, both in the on-court and from the leadership perspective here. I do hope this is the start of this, that I think how Joel Embiid shows up next year from the personality and from the health standpoint is pretty much going to drive the boat for what direction this season is going, and I'm encouraged at least that we're seeing more and more of these stories start to leak out. So shout out to Tyrese Haliburton for putting that on the press there, for speaking highly of our guy Joel Embiid, and shout out to Tyrese for doing his business in the playoffs as well. I won't lie, I've become a little bit of a fan of this Pacers team, watching how hard they compete with Haliburton, certainly the head of the snake there. So a good battle up to against the Cavs at the time of me recording that. But let me know what you guys think about this in the comments here. Give your thoughts on Tyrese Haliburton overall. Is he the most overrated player in the NBA? Because I kind of think that's insane at this point. But if anything, make sure you guys are subscribing. As always, appreciate each and every one of you guys for tuning in this video here. Hit a like if you have not already. I'll be back talking to you next time right here on Sixers Digest. Peace.